They say blood runs thicker than water, but let me tell you something, greed runs thicker than both. My name is Dorothy, I'm 73 years old, and 6 months ago, I discovered that my own daughter's husband was planning to have me committed to a mental institution so he could steal my fortune. But here's the thing, I wasn't shocked. I'd been watching, waiting, and preparing for this moment longer than he could have ever imagined. Before I tell you how I got my revenge at their baby's naming ceremony, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. I've gotten messages from people all over the world who've been betrayed by family, and knowing you're out there listening gives me strength to share what really happened during those dark months. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever suspected that people you trusted were plotting behind your back, then this story is going to hit you like a freight train. And if it does, please hit that subscribe button, because stories like mine need to be told. Too many elderly people suffer in silence while their own family members circle like vultures, waiting for them to become vulnerable enough to exploit. I lived in a beautiful colonial home in Westchester County, New York, for 47 years. My late husband Robert and I built our life there, raised our daughter Cassandra, and accumulated what most people would consider substantial wealth through his successful law practice and my interior design business. When Robert passed 3 years ago, I inherited everything: the house worth $2 million, his life insurance, retirement accounts, and various investments totaling roughly $4.5 million. Cassandra was my only child, and after Robert's death, she became increasingly concerned about me living alone. At first, I was touched by her attention. She'd call daily, visit twice a week, always asking how I was managing, if I needed help with anything. Her husband Trevor seemed supportive too, nodding along when she'd suggest I might be safer with family nearby. Trevor Walsh had married my daughter 8 years earlier, and I'd never quite warmed to him, though I couldn't put my finger on why. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove expensive cars, and had a way of making every conversation about money without seeming obvious about it. During family dinners, he'd casually mention how much houses were selling for in the neighborhood, or comment on how well my investments must be performing. Robert used to joke that Trevor counted other people's money as a hobby. After the funeral, Trevor's interest in my finances became less subtle. He'd offer to help me review my portfolio, suggesting I might want to simplify my affairs. He knew a financial advisor, he said, someone who specialized in helping widows manage their assets more efficiently. When I politely declined, explaining that Robert's longtime advisor was handling everything perfectly well, I caught something cold flash across his eyes before he smiled and said, "Of course, whatever made me comfortable." The pressure intensified when Cassandra became pregnant with their first child. Suddenly, my living alone wasn't just unsafe, it was irresponsible. What if I fell? What if I had a medical emergency? What if my mind started going and I did something dangerous? The questions came daily, wrapped in concern but sharp enough to cut. I started paying closer attention to their visits. Trevor would wander through my house while Cassandra and I talked, his eyes appraising everything from my artwork to my jewelry collection. He'd comment on how much space I had for just one person, how expensive it must be to maintain such a large property. When I mentioned considering downsizing someday, he became immediately helpful, offering to research retirement communities and assisted living facilities. But it was the little things that really disturbed me. My mail would be moved when they visited. Papers on my desk would be shuffled. Trevor asked pointed questions about my will, about whether I'd updated it since Robert's death, about who had power of attorney. When I told him my lawyer handled all that, he suggested I might want someone in the family to have those responsibilities, just in case. The breaking point came 4 months ago when Cassandra announced they wanted me to move in with them. Their reasoning was perfect: I'd be safer, I could help with the baby when it arrived, and we'd all be closer as a family. They'd even remodeled their guest suite just for me, complete with a private bathroom and sitting area. How could I say no to such generous, caring children? Except I knew it wasn't generosity. It was positioning. Once I was in their house, under their roof, dependent on their care, they'd have complete control over my daily life. And Trevor's questions about my mental state were becoming more frequent and more pointed. Had I been forgetting things? Was I taking my medications properly? Had my doctor expressed any concerns about cognitive decline? The truth was, my mind was sharp as a tack. I managed my own finances, maintained my home, drove myself everywhere I needed to go, and could run circles around people half my age when it came to managing complex situations. But I realized Trevor was building a narrative, planting seeds of doubt about my competency that could be harvested later when he needed them. So I made a decision that probably saved my life. I started pretending to be exactly the confused, declining elderly woman he wanted me to be. I began making small mistakes when he was around, forgetting his name occasionally, mixing up appointments, seeming overwhelmed by simple tasks. It wasn't hard to act confused when someone was actively trying to manipulate you. The confusion was real. I just wasn't the one experiencing it. The performance worked better than I expected. Trevor became more confident, more careless with his comments and questions. He started talking to Cassandra about me as if I wasn't in the room, discussing my episodes and decline with the kind of clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. My own daughter would nod along, her face creased with worry that I now realized might have been rehearsed. 3 months ago, I moved into their guest suite, bringing only personal items and leaving my house beautifully maintained but empty. Trevor had insisted I didn't need to hire house sitters or caretakers. He'd keep an eye on the property for me. How thoughtful. How convenient. How perfectly positioned to start moving pieces into place for whatever he was really planning. Living in their house was like being a mouse in a laboratory. Every move I made was watched, analyzed, documented. Cassandra would ask me the same questions multiple times to see if my answers matched. Trevor would leave medications in obvious places to see if I'd take them correctly. They'd test my memory, my reasoning, my ability to manage simple tasks, always with concerned smiles and loving voices. But I wasn't the confused old woman they thought they were studying. I was studying them right back, and what I discovered was far worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't just about getting me out of my house. This was about getting me out of the picture entirely. And the baby that was supposed to bring our family together was actually just another pawn in a game I was finally beginning to understand. The night that changed everything was 6 weeks ago, when their son Marcus was born. I'd been living with them for almost 2 months by then, playing my role perfectly, watching them circle closer and closer to whatever trap they were setting. But nothing could have prepared me for what I overheard at 1 a.m. that cold October night, or for what I learned about my own daughter's involvement in her husband's plan. That conversation didn't just reveal their plot, it revealed who Cassandra really was, and who she'd been all along. And that's when I realized that my perfect little performance as a declining old woman was about to become the weapon I'd use to destroy them both. If you're still with me, you understand that family betrayal hits different than any other kind of pain. It's not just the loss of trust, it's the shattering realization that the people you loved most never really existed at all. Let me take you back to understand how I raised the daughter who would eventually plot my destruction. Cassandra Marie Walsh, née Morrison, was born on a snowy February morning in 1985. From the moment she drew breath, that child was the center of our universe. Robert and I had tried for years to have children, going through fertility treatments, miscarriages, and heartbreak until finally, miraculously, Cassandra arrived. She was everything we'd dreamed of: intelligent, beautiful, charming. As a toddler, she had these enormous blue eyes and golden curls that made strangers stop us on the street to comment on her beauty. But it wasn't just her appearance that captivated people. Cassandra had an innate ability to read what adults wanted and give it to them. She was the child who never threw tantrums, who always said please and thank you, who could work a room full of my friends like a tiny politician. Looking back now, I wonder if that gift was actually a warning sign I was too besotted to recognize. Robert spoiled her outrageously. Every dance class, every riding lesson, every summer camp she wanted. No expense was too great for our little princess. When she decided she wanted to be a lawyer like Daddy, he lit up like Christmas morning. When she changed her mind and wanted to study art history, he supported that too. When she switched to psychology, then to marketing, then finally settled on communications, we celebrated each transition as evidence of her well-rounded interests. She went to private school, then to Vassar College, where she majored in communications and minored in theater. The theater part makes more sense to me now. Cassandra had been acting her entire life. I just never realized I was the audience being deceived. During college, she dated extensively but never seriously. She was too smart, too focused, too ambitious to get tied down by some college boy, she'd tell us. She was waiting for the right man, someone who could match her intelligence and share her vision for the future. Someone who understood that she came from quality, from money, from a family that had expectations. She graduated magna cum laude and moved back home while she looked for the perfect job in Manhattan. For 6 months, she lived in her childhood bedroom, sending out resumes and going on interviews while Robert and I covered her expenses. It was during this time that she started dating Trevor. They met at a wine bar in White Plains through mutual friends. Trevor was 32 to her 23, established in his pharmaceutical sales career, and completely smitten with my daughter. He sent flowers, took her to expensive restaurants, bought her jewelry for no special occasions. Within 3 months, he was practically living at our house, charming Robert with talk about baseball and business while helping me in the kitchen with dinner preparations. I have to admit, Trevor played the perfect boyfriend beautifully. He complimented my cooking, remembered details about my interior design projects, and always insisted on helping with dishes. He asked thoughtful questions about our family history and seemed genuinely interested in our stories about building our life together. He treated Cassandra like a queen but was never arrogant about his own success. The red flags were so small that I dismissed them as personality quirks. Trevor would ask detailed questions about our financial advisor, our insurance policies, our investment strategies. When Robert talked about his practice, Trevor wanted to know about partnerships, about succession planning, about what happened to a firm's assets when the senior partner retired. He showed unusual interest in our real estate holdings, asking about property taxes, market values, and appreciation rates. At the time, I attributed his curiosity to the natural interests of a successful young man who was serious about my daughter. If he was planning a future with Cassandra, it made sense that he'd want to understand the family he was marrying into. Robert actually appreciated having another man around who could discuss business and investments intelligently. They got engaged 18 months after they started dating. Trevor proposed during a weekend trip to the Hamptons, with a 3-carat diamond ring that must have cost him 3 months' salary. The engagement party was lavish, held at the country club where Robert and I had been members for 25 years. Trevor's family was there. His parents seemed nice enough, middle-class people from New Jersey who were clearly overwhelmed by the entire production but trying to fit in. The wedding was everything Cassandra had dreamed of since childhood. We spared no expense. The reception was at the Plaza Hotel, her dress was custom designed, and the guest list included 350 people. Robert walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his face, and I wept through the entire ceremony. My baby girl looked like a fairy tale princess, and Trevor looked like the luckiest man alive. For the first few years of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. They bought a beautiful house in Scarsdale with help from Robert for the down payment. Trevor's career flourished, and he was promoted to regional sales manager. Cassandra found work at a Manhattan marketing firm, though she quit after 2 years, claiming the commute was exhausting and the work unfulfilling. Instead, she threw herself into being the perfect wife and socialite. She joined committees, organized charity events, took cooking classes, and redecorated their house twice. When friends asked when they were planning to start a family, she'd smile mysteriously and say they were enjoying being newlyweds for now. But I started noticing changes in my daughter during those early years of marriage. The spontaneous affection she'd always shown me became more calculated, more performative. Her visits felt scheduled, purposeful. Our conversations began following patterns. She'd ask about my health, my activities, my plans, but she seemed more interested in gathering information than actually connecting with me. Trevor's influence was subtle but persistent. He'd make comments about how exhausting it must be for me to maintain such a large house, how worried he was about me driving at night, how much peace of mind it would give him and Cassandra if they knew I was somewhere safer. He'd share stories about elderly relatives who'd been taken advantage of by unscrupulous contractors or financial advisors, always with the suggestion that families should be more involved in protecting their older members. When Robert started showing signs of heart problems 3 years ago, Trevor became increasingly helpful. He researched cardiologists, drove Robert to appointments when I couldn't, and took detailed notes about treatment plans and medications. He asked intelligent questions about prognosis and care options, and both Robert and I were grateful for his support during a frightening time. Looking back, I realized Trevor was positioning himself as the responsible family member, the one who took charge during crises and made sure important details weren't overlooked. When Robert had his fatal heart attack 18 months later, Trevor handled many of the funeral arrangements, dealt with insurance companies, and helped me navigate the immediate legal and financial complexities of widowhood. I was drowning in grief and overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility of managing everything Robert had always handled. Trevor's assistance felt like a lifeline. He connected me with estate attorneys, helped me understand insurance policies, and made sure I didn't miss important deadlines or requirements. Cassandra was grieving too, but she seemed paralyzed by the loss, leaving most of the practical matters to her capable husband. It was during those vulnerable months after Robert's death that Trevor began his careful campaign to undermine my confidence and independence. He'd point out mistakes I'd made, suggest that I seemed overwhelmed by tasks that used to be simple for me, and recommend that I consider simplifying my life. His concern felt genuine because my grief was real, my confusion was real, and my sense of being lost without Robert was real. But Trevor was a salesman, trained to identify needs and create solutions. And I was a newly widowed woman with substantial assets and no male protection. In his mind, I probably looked like the perfect target, vulnerable, isolated, and controllable. All he had to do was convince me that I needed his help, and then gradually expand that help until it became complete control. The pregnancy announcement 8 months ago should have been pure joy. Instead, it marked the beginning of the most intense phase of their campaign to relocate me and gain access to my assets. Suddenly, my safety wasn't just about me anymore. It was about their child's grandmother, about family responsibility, about creating the kind of support system that would benefit everyone. And I might have fallen for it completely if I hadn't spent 47 years married to one of the best attorneys in Westchester County. Robert had taught me to read people, to recognize manipulation, and to always look for the motive behind someone's actions. Those lessons were about to save my life, even though they came too late to save my faith in my only child. The day I moved into their guest suite was the day I truly understood what it meant to be a prisoner in a golden cage. If you've ever had to depend on family members who you're starting to suspect don't have your best interests at heart, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It was a beautiful September morning when Trevor arrived with a moving truck to collect my personal belongings from the house Robert and I had shared for nearly 5 decades. I'd spent the previous week carefully selecting what to bring: clothing, photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, some books, and my laptop. Everything that really mattered to me, everything that held memories or value, I left behind in that house. Trevor was insistent that I didn't need much. The guest suite was fully furnished, he reminded me, and they wanted me to feel like I was staying in a luxury hotel, not moving into storage. Besides, I could always go back and get things if I needed them. He had keys to the house now. I'd given them to him the week before, along with the security codes, so he could check on the property while I was away. The guest suite really was beautiful. Cassandra had decorated it in soft blues and cream colors, with a comfortable reading chair by the window and a small kitchenette for tea and light meals. The bathroom had been completely renovated with safety features: grab bars, a walk-in shower, non-slip flooring. They'd thought of everything an elderly person might need. But luxury amenities couldn't disguise the fact that this room was designed to contain me, not comfort me. The first thing I noticed was that the kitchenette had no real cooking capability, just a mini refrigerator, a microwave, and a single-cup coffee maker. When I asked about using the main kitchen, Cassandra explained that she preferred to do the cooking for everyone, and wouldn't it be easier for me to just join them for meals? That way, I wouldn't have to worry about shopping or meal planning, and they could make sure I was eating properly. The second thing I noticed was that my room was at the far end of the house, separated from their bedroom and the main living areas by a long hallway. During the day, this felt like privacy. At night, it felt like isolation. If I had a medical emergency, if I fell, if I needed help, would they even hear me calling? Trevor had installed an intercom system, he explained, showing me the small device on my nightstand. All I had to do was press a button and I could reach them instantly. He demonstrated how it worked, and his voice came through clearly from their bedroom. Such a thoughtful detail, such a caring son-in-law. Except the intercom was one way. I could call them, but they could also listen to me whenever they wanted. It took me 3 days to find the tiny camera hidden in the bedroom light fixture, and another 2 days to locate the one in the bathroom mirror. My caring family wasn't just monitoring my meals and medications, they were watching my every move. The daily routine they established for me was presented as structure and safety. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Medications at precise times, with Trevor or Cassandra watching to make sure I took them correctly. A morning walk around their neighborhood for exercise, always accompanied by one of them. Afternoon activities like reading or watching television in the main living room where they could keep me company. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? A loving family making sure their elderly mother gets proper nutrition, medical care, and social interaction. But every element of that routine was designed to demonstrate my dependence on them and document my need for supervision. The medications were the first major red flag. My actual prescriptions were simple: blood pressure medication, a low-dose aspirin, and vitamins. But Trevor had consulted with a doctor friend who recommended adding supplements for cognitive health and sleep aids to help me adjust to the new environment. Just temporary additions, he assured me, until I settled in. Within a week of taking their enhanced medication regimen, I was experiencing symptoms I'd never had before. Mild confusion in the mornings, drowsiness in the afternoons, occasional memory lapses that left me searching for words or forgetting details of conversations. When I mentioned these issues, Trevor would exchange meaningful glances with Cassandra and make notes on a small pad he'd started carrying. The notes were supposedly to help them communicate with my doctor about how I was adjusting, but I realized they were actually building a medical record of cognitive decline. Every forgotten name, every repeated question, every moment of confusion was carefully documented as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. I started pretending to take the extra medications while actually palming them and disposing of them later. The improvement in my mental clarity was immediate and dramatic. But I had to be careful not to show too much improvement too quickly, or they'd become suspicious. Instead, I began a careful performance of gradual decline, mixing moments of lucidity with increasing signs of confusion and dependence. The performance was easier than I expected because living in that house was genuinely disorienting. I was isolated from my normal routines, my familiar environment, and my established social connections. My longtime friends couldn't visit easily. Trevor would explain that I was having a difficult day, or that the doctor had recommended limiting stimulation. My weekly bridge group was told I'd had to quit. My volunteer work at the library was suspended indefinitely. Slowly but systematically, they were erasing my independent life and replacing it with complete dependence on them. And the more dependent I became, the more concerned they grew about my ability to manage my own affairs. Trevor began having conversations with me about practical matters that I would allegedly find overwhelming. Had I considered what would happen if I became too confused to pay bills or make financial decisions? Wouldn't it make sense to have someone trustworthy handle those responsibilities before they became too burdensome for me? He knew a lawyer who specialized in elder law, someone who could help us set up the kind of protections that would give everyone peace of mind. When I insisted that my own attorney was handling everything perfectly well, Trevor would nod understandingly while making more notes. Resistance to help was apparently another symptom of cognitive decline. So was insistence on maintaining independence despite obvious limitations. My perfectly reasonable responses to his suggestions were being reframed as evidence of impaired judgment. The isolation was the worst part. In my own home, I'd had independence, privacy, and control over my daily life. I could see friends when I wanted, go where I wanted, eat what I wanted, and spend my time however I chose. Here, every decision was filtered through Trevor and Cassandra's assessment of what was best for me. They weren't cruel about it. In fact, they were unfailingly patient and kind, always framing their control as protection and their restrictions as care. But the result was the same. I was becoming a non-person, someone whose preferences, opinions, and decisions mattered less and less each day. 3 weeks after I moved in, Cassandra announced she was pregnant. The timing felt too convenient, too perfectly aligned with their campaign to relocate me and assume control of my life. A baby would require even more family stability, even more financial security, even more reason for me to surrender my independence for the greater good of the family. The pregnancy also gave them a powerful emotional weapon. How could I be selfish enough to worry about my own autonomy when there was a grandchild to consider? Wouldn't I want to help provide for my grandchild's future? Didn't I want to be part of a loving, stable family environment where a child could thrive? But the pregnancy revealed something else that chilled me to the bone. During one of Cassandra's prenatal appointments, I overheard her talking to Trevor about genetic testing and family medical history. She was particularly interested in any history of dementia, Alzheimer's, or cognitive decline in our family. When I asked why, she explained that they wanted to be prepared for any potential issues. Except there was no history of cognitive decline in our family. Robert had been sharp until the day he died. My own parents lived into their 90s with their minds intact. Cassandra knew this as well as I did. Unless she was planning to create that history herself. That night, I lay in my isolated room at the far end of their house, listening to them talk in low voices in their bedroom down the hall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, conspiratorial. They were planning something, and the pieces were falling into place faster than I'd realized. I needed to find out exactly what they were planning and how much time I had before they put their plan into action. But to do that, I'd have to take risks that could expose my own deception and put me in even greater danger. The next morning, I decided it was time to stop being a passive victim and start gathering intelligence. If Trevor wanted to treat me like a confused old woman, I'd give him exactly what he expected while using that cover to discover the truth about what he and my daughter were really planning. It was time to turn their own weapon against them. And it was time to find out just how far they were willing to go to get their hands on my money. Learning to be invisible in your own life is a skill no one should have to master, but sometimes survival depends on becoming exactly what your enemies expect you to be. If you've ever had to hide your true thoughts and feelings from people who claim to love you, you'll understand the exhausting complexity of maintaining a performance that could save your life. My transformation into the confused elderly woman Trevor and Cassandra wanted me to be required careful study and subtle execution. I couldn't suddenly become dramatically impaired, that would raise suspicions. Instead, I had to create a gradual decline that felt natural and inevitable, while secretly gathering information about their real plans. The medication routine became my first opportunity for both performance and investigation. Each morning, Trevor would bring me my pills in a small plastic container, carefully labeled with days of the week. He'd watch as I took each one, occasionally commenting on their importance for my health and cognitive function. What he didn't know was that I'd become quite skilled at palming pills and disposing of them later. But I started taking some of them sporadically, just enough to create inconsistent symptoms that would support their narrative of declining mental function. One day I'd be sharp and alert, the next I'd seem foggy and confused. The inconsistency was crucial. It suggested progressive cognitive issues that weren't severe enough yet to require immediate intervention, but were concerning enough to warrant increased supervision. My performance expanded into daily conversations and activities. I'd forget Trevor's name occasionally, calling him Robert or mixing up his identity with Cassandra's previous boyfriends. I'd repeat questions I'd asked earlier, lose track of conversations mid-sentence, and struggle with simple tasks like operating the television remote or remembering where I'd put my reading glasses. The key was to make these episodes feel organic rather than theatrical. Real cognitive decline isn't consistent or predictable. It comes in waves, with good days and bad days, moments of clarity followed by periods of confusion. I studied my own grandmother's decline during her final years, remembering the specific ways her mind had played tricks on her. Cassandra began keeping detailed notes about my episodes. She'd write down everything, the date, time, duration, and specific symptoms of each incident. She claimed these records would help her communicate with my doctor about adjusting my medications, but I realized she was actually building a comprehensive case file documenting my mental deterioration. Trevor installed additional monitoring devices throughout the house, supposedly for my safety. Motion sensors in the hallways would alert them if I wandered at night. A medication dispenser with a timer would ensure I took pills at proper intervals. Smart home features allowed them to track my daily activities remotely. When I got up, when I ate, when I watched television, when I went to bed. Living under constant surveillance was mentally exhausting, but it also gave me opportunities to observe their behavior when they thought I wasn't paying attention. During my confused periods, they'd talk more freely around me, discussing plans and concerns as if I couldn't understand or remember what they were saying. That's how I learned about their financial pressures. Trevor's pharmaceutical sales job was more precarious than he'd let on. His company was downsizing, and several regional managers had already been eliminated. He was carrying significant debt from their lifestyle. The house, the cars, Cassandra's spending habits, and a baby was going to add substantial expenses. They needed my assets not just for future security, but for immediate financial survival. Cassandra had been researching elder law and guardianship procedures with disturbing thoroughness. She'd contacted attorneys who specialized in conservatorship cases, asking hypothetical questions about what evidence would be required to demonstrate that an elderly person was no longer capable of managing their own affairs. She'd also been researching residential care facilities, focusing on memory care units and secured dementia facilities. The pattern was becoming clear. They planned to have me declared mentally incompetent, assume legal guardianship of my person and assets, and then place me in institutional care where I'd be completely under their control. Once I was out of the way, they'd have access to my house, my investments, and my inheritance, everything they needed to solve their financial problems and secure their future. But the timeline for their plan kept accelerating. Initially, I thought I had months or even years to figure out how to protect myself. Then I realized they were aiming to complete the process before the baby was born. They wanted everything settled so they could focus on parenthood without financial stress. But as I gathered more intelligence, I discovered they were moving even faster than that. Trevor had already scheduled appointments with elder law attorneys. Cassandra had researched the legal requirements for emergency guardianship orders. They'd obtained preliminary information about committing me to a psychiatric facility for evaluation, which could happen much more quickly than traditional guardianship proceedings if they could demonstrate that I posed a danger to myself. The danger angle was particularly insidious. They began documenting incidents where I'd supposedly left the stove on, forgotten to lock doors, or taken medication incorrectly. Most of these incidents were fabricated, but they were building a paper trail that would support emergency intervention to protect my safety and the safety of others. I realized that my window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Whatever I was going to do to protect myself, I had to do soon. But I still didn't know the full scope of their plan, and I couldn't act without understanding every element of what they were trying to accomplish. That's when I decided to take my biggest risk yet. Trevor kept a home office where he handled both his sales work and personal business. The room was off-limits to me, supposedly because he kept confidential client information there, but it was where he made his private phone calls and stored documents related to their campaign against me. If I was going to understand the complete plan, I needed to get into that office and see what he'd been hiding. The challenge was timing. Trevor worked from home 2 days a week, and Cassandra was almost always somewhere in the house. I needed them both to be gone for at least an hour, and I needed to be having a good day mentally so I could function clearly while maintaining my cover story if they returned unexpectedly. My opportunity came 3 weeks later when Cassandra had a prenatal appointment and Trevor had a client meeting that would keep him in Manhattan for the afternoon. They debated whether to take me with them or find someone to stay with me, but I played my part perfectly, acting tired and slightly confused, expressing preference for staying home and resting. They left me with strict instructions to call immediately if I needed anything, and Trevor activated extra monitoring systems to track my movements while they were away. But I'd been studying those systems for weeks, and I knew exactly how to move through the house without triggering alerts. Getting into Trevor's office required picking a simple lock, a skill Robert had taught me years earlier when I'd locked myself out of our bedroom. The office was meticulously organized, with files labeled by category and documents arranged in careful chronological order. Trevor's attention to detail was going to be his downfall. What I found in that office was worse than I'd imagined. They weren't just planning to steal my money, they were planning to erase my existence entirely. The files contained detailed research on memory care facilities in other states, far from anyone who might visit me or advocate on my behalf. They'd investigated the legal requirements for involuntary commitment, including how to prevent patients from communicating with outside attorneys or family members. But the most chilling discovery was a draft document titled Dorothy Morrison Memory Care Treatment Plan. It outlined a comprehensive program of psychiatric medications and therapeutic interventions designed to manage my aggressive tendencies and delusional episodes. The plan included heavy sedation, restricted communication privileges, and isolation protocols that would effectively silence me permanently. They weren't just planning to rob me. They were planning to bury me alive in a pharmaceutical fog where no one would ever believe anything I said about what they'd done to me. I photographed everything with my phone, working quickly but carefully to document their entire scheme. Then I returned the files to their exact positions and relocked the office door. By the time they returned home, I was napping peacefully in my room, the picture of a harmless elderly woman who'd spent a quiet afternoon resting. That night, I lay in bed processing what I'd learned and planning my response. They thought they were so clever, building their case methodically while keeping me isolated and dependent. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their planning. They'd underestimated the woman they were trying to destroy. And now that I knew exactly what they were planning, it was time to start planning my own surprise for them. The baby's naming ceremony was still 2 weeks away, but I was going to need every one of those days to prepare the kind of revelation that would expose their scheme and protect other elderly people from becoming their next victims. Trevor Walsh was about to learn that this confused old woman he'd been manipulating was actually the most dangerous enemy he'd ever made. Some moments change everything. Some conversations reveal truths so devastating that they transform your entire understanding of reality. What I heard at 1 a.m. on that cold October night didn't just confirm my worst fears, it shattered my heart and ignited a fury that would fuel my revenge for months to come. If you've been following my story, you know I'd been living in Trevor and Cassandra's house for almost 2 months, carefully playing the role of a declining elderly woman while secretly documenting their plan to steal my fortune and destroy my life. But nothing I'd discovered in Trevor's office had prepared me for what I was about to learn about my own daughter's involvement in their scheme. I'd been having trouble sleeping that night. The medication I was pretending to take often left me genuinely restless, and the isolation of being in that room at the far end of their house made me feel disconnected from the world. Around midnight, I decided to make myself some tea and maybe read for a while until I felt drowsy. I was padding quietly down the hallway toward the kitchen when I heard Trevor's voice coming from his office. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the glow of his computer screen in the darkness. He was on a phone call, speaking in the low, urgent tones people use when they're discussing something they don't want anyone else to hear. Every instinct told me to go back to my room and pretend I'd never left it. But something about his tone, predatory and confident, made me freeze in place. I pressed myself against the wall and listened. "The meds are making her confused," Trevor was saying to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Tomorrow I'll get her committed, then I just need to get rid of my wife and all that money is ours." My blood ran cold, but I wasn't shocked. Not about the money, not about the commitment plan. I'd already discovered those details during my investigation of his office. What shocked me was the casual way he'd said get rid of my wife. My daughter. The mother of his child. The voice on the other end was muffled, but I could hear someone responding with what sounded like questions or concerns. Trevor's laugh was cold and calculating. "Cassandra thinks she's running this show, but she has no idea how expendable she really is," he continued. "Once I have legal control of Dorothy's assets and the old woman is locked away, I don't need a wife anymore. Especially not one who knows too much about how we got the money." I had to grip the wall to keep from collapsing. This wasn't just about stealing my fortune. Trevor was planning to eliminate both his wife and his mother-in-law to cover his tracks and keep everything for himself. "The baby complicates things, but not much," Trevor said, his voice growing more animated as he outlined his plan. "Single fathers get sympathy, especially wealthy ones. I'll be the tragic widower whose wife couldn't handle the stress of caring for her mentally ill mother. Postpartum depression, maybe a medication mix-up, something that looks like suicide or accidental overdose." The person on the other end seemed to be asking about timing, because Trevor pulled up what sounded like a calendar on his computer. "Dorothy gets committed tomorrow or the next day. I've got the emergency order ready to file as soon as she has another one of her episodes. Once she's in the facility and medicated into compliance, I'll have maybe 2 weeks before anyone starts asking questions about guardianship procedures. That gives me enough time to handle Cassandra and start liquidating assets." I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to breathe quietly through my mouth. Every word of this conversation was confirming my worst fears while revealing new horrors I hadn't even considered. "The naming ceremony is perfect timing," Trevor continued. "Cassandra's whole family will be there, all her friends, everyone who matters in her social circle. After that, she won't have any more public appearances scheduled. I can keep her isolated at home, tell people she's struggling with postpartum depression, needs privacy and quiet to recover." My hands were shaking as I realized the full scope of his plan. The baby's naming ceremony wasn't just a family celebration, it was going to be Cassandra's last public appearance. Trevor was planning to use that event as the final stage before disposing of his wife and completing his theft of my estate. "You worry too much," Trevor said to his unknown accomplice. "I've been planning this for 3 years, ever since I figured out how much money Dorothy really has. Cassandra was always just a means to an end, a way to get close to the family and position myself as the trustworthy son-in-law. She served her purpose by giving me access and legitimacy, but now she's a liability." The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. My daughter had loved this man, trusted him, built a life with him, carried his child, and he was discussing her murder like a business transaction that had outlived its usefulness. "The beauty of it is that no one will suspect anything," Trevor continued. "I'll be the grieving husband and son-in-law, suddenly responsible for a newborn and dealing with the tragic loss of my wife and the institutionalization of my mother-in-law. People will feel sorry for me, want to help me, trust me even more than they do now." I heard him typing on his computer, apparently pulling up documents or making notes. "I've already got the life insurance policies structured properly, double indemnity for accidental death, full payout even for suicide after the waiting period. Between Cassandra's policies and Dorothy's estate, we're looking at over $6 million, all of it clean and legitimate." The person on the other end must have asked about investigation risks, because Trevor's tone became even more confident. "What investigation? A confused elderly woman with documented cognitive decline gets committed for her own safety. Happens every day. A young mother with a family history of mental illness succumbs to postpartum depression. Tragic but not suspicious. I'll be the victim in both cases, not the perpetrator. I realized he was right. His plan was sophisticated enough and gradual enough that it probably would work. By the time anyone realized what had happened, both Cassandra and I would be gone, and Trevor would be the sympathetic survivor with legal access to everything we'd owned. "Stop worrying about Dorothy," Trevor said, apparently responding to concerns from his accomplice. "She's exactly where I need her, isolated, medicated, documented as mentally incompetent, and completely dependent on me for everything. Tomorrow's commitment hearing is just a formality. The judge will rubber-stamp the emergency order based on the evidence I've been building for months." He paused, and I could hear him moving around in his chair. Besides, even if she somehow figured out what was happening, who would believe her? A confused old woman with documented dementia, claiming that her devoted son-in-law is plotting against her? They'd just see it as another paranoid episode and increase her medication. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Trevor outlining details about asset transfers, legal procedures, and timeline management. But I'd heard enough to understand that I had less than 24 hours before he filed the papers to have me committed, and less than 2 weeks before he murdered my daughter. When Trevor finally ended the call, I waited until I heard him leave his office and go upstairs to bed. Then I crept back to my room, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd discovered. Trevor wasn't just planning to steal from me, he was planning to commit the perfect double murder, using his victim's own love and trust as weapons against them. Cassandra had no idea that the husband she adored was planning to kill her as soon as she was no longer useful to his scheme. But Trevor had made one crucial miscalculation in his planning. He assumed that I was actually the confused, helpless old woman I'd been pretending to be. He had no idea that I'd been gathering intelligence on his activities for months, or that I'd already documented much of his scheme. And he certainly had no idea that I'd just overheard him planning to murder my daughter. That conversation changed everything. This was no longer just about protecting my own assets or exposing financial fraud. This was about saving Cassandra's life and stopping a man who was planning to commit multiple murders to cover up his crimes. I spent the rest of that sleepless night planning my counterattack. Trevor thought he was going to surprise us at the naming ceremony with his loving family man performance before moving into the final phase of his plan. But I was going to give him a surprise that would destroy him completely. The naming ceremony was still 12 days away. That gave me 12 days to prepare evidence, arrange backup plans, and set up the kind of revelation that would not only expose Trevor's scheme but ensure that he could never hurt another family the way he'd hurt mine. Trevor Walsh had spent 3 years positioning himself as the perfect son-in-law while planning to destroy everyone who trusted him. Now he was about to learn what happened when you underestimated a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Rage is a powerful fuel, but revenge requires precision. After hearing Trevor's plan to murder my daughter and commit me to steal our fortune, I had 12 days to orchestrate the kind of justice that would not only stop him but ensure he could never hurt another family. If you've ever felt that burning need to protect someone you love from a predator who's fooled everyone else, you'll understand the cold calculation that took over my grief. That morning after the phone call, I began the most important performance of my life. I had to continue playing the confused elderly woman while secretly preparing for war. Every moment had to look natural, every action had to support their narrative of my decline, while I gathered evidence and arranged the elements of Trevor's destruction. The first challenge was communication. My phone calls and internet activity were monitored, my mail was screened, and my movements were tracked. But Trevor's surveillance system had one weakness: he was so confident in his control that he'd become careless about covering his tracks. During my confused episodes, I would wander around the house, sometimes ending up in rooms where I supposedly didn't belong. These episodes gave me access to Trevor's office, where I could photograph documents and copy files to a thumb drive I'd hidden in my makeup case. Trevor would find me there occasionally, gently guide me back to my room, and make notes about my disorientation, never realizing I'd been documenting his crimes. I also discovered that Trevor had been recording our conversations to build evidence of my cognitive decline. But his recording system worked both ways. I could access those files and copy the conversations where he and Cassandra discussed their plans. They'd been incredibly careless about what they said around me, assuming I was too confused to understand or remember their discussions. The evidence I gathered was damning. Financial documents showing Trevor's debts and cash flow problems. Legal research about guardianship procedures and involuntary commitment. medical consultations about psychiatric medications and their effects on elderly patients, draft documents for asset transfers and insurance claims. Everything I needed to prove his intent to defraud me and endanger Cassandra. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to expose Trevor in a way that would prevent him from talking his way out of the situation or finding another victim. The naming ceremony was perfect, a public event with witnesses, including people who could verify my mental competence and Trevor's deception. I began reaching out to old friends and professional contacts, using methods Trevor couldn't monitor. I had a bridge partner, Eleanor Patterson, who lived in my old neighborhood and had been trying to visit me for weeks. Trevor always made excuses about my health or energy levels, but Eleanor was persistent. I managed to call her from a neighbor's phone during one of my walks and arrange a secret meeting. Eleanor was shocked by what I told her, but she'd known me for 30 years and could see that my mind was completely sharp. She agreed to help by contacting my longtime attorney, James Rothschild, and my financial advisor, Michael Chen. Both men had been trying to reach me about routine matters, but Trevor had been intercepting their calls and emails, claiming I was too confused to handle business discussions. Through Eleanor, I arranged for both James and Michael to attend the naming ceremony as surprise guests. I also had her contact my former neighbor, Dr. Patricia Weinstein, a psychiatrist who could observe my behavior and provide professional testimony about my mental state if needed. The most crucial element of my plan was documentation. I needed real-time evidence of Trevor's deception and Cassandra's involvement. Using skills Robert had taught me years earlier, I set up my own recording system in common areas of the house. Trevor thought he was the only one documenting conversations, but I was recording everything too. What I discovered about Cassandra broke my heart even as it strengthened my resolve. She wasn't an innocent victim being manipulated by her husband, she was an active participant in the scheme. The recordings revealed that she'd been researching my finances and discussing my declining mental state with Trevor for months before I moved in with them. Cassandra had suggested the guest suite isolation, recommended the additional medications, and helped plan my social isolation. She'd practiced concerned daughter conversations in front of mirrors, perfecting the worried expressions and loving tones she used to manipulate me. The pregnancy itself might have been timed to provide additional emotional leverage and legal complications. But the most devastating recording was a conversation between Cassandra and Trevor about what would happen after they gained control of my assets. Cassandra talked about the trips they'd take, the house they'd buy, the lifestyle they'd finally be able to afford. She discussed my future institutionalization like she was planning a vacation, wondering how often they'd need to visit me to maintain appearances. My daughter had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who could plot against her own mother with the same casual cruelty her husband showed. The grief of that realization nearly broke me, but it also freed me from any lingering guilt about what I was planning to do to both of them. 6 days before the naming ceremony, I had everything I needed except one crucial element: insurance that Trevor couldn't escape consequences even if my public revelation somehow failed. I needed backup protection for both Cassandra and myself that would activate regardless of how the ceremony went. That's when I decided to involve law enforcement directly. Using Eleanor as an intermediary, I arranged a meeting with Detective Sarah Rodriguez of the Westchester County Sheriff's Office. Sarah specialized in elder abuse cases and had worked with James Rothschild on previous guardianship fraud investigations. She agreed to review my evidence and coordinate with the district attorney's office if the case warranted criminal charges. Sarah was impressed by the quality of evidence I'd gathered and the sophistication of Trevor's scheme. She'd seen similar cases before, but never one where the victim had been able to document the crime in such detail while it was happening. She agreed to have plainclothes officers at the naming ceremony, positioned to intervene if Trevor tried to flee or retaliate when his plan was exposed. But Sarah also warned me about the risks I was taking. If Trevor realized I'd been deceiving him, he might accelerate his timeline and become desperate enough to harm both Cassandra and me before we could stop him. She offered to arrest him immediately based on the evidence I'd gathered, but I convinced her that a public exposure would be more effective at preventing him from victimizing other families in the future. The final piece of my plan involved Marcus, the innocent baby whose naming ceremony would become the stage for his father's downfall. I couldn't let Trevor's crimes traumatize that child or leave him without any family support. Through James Rothschild, I arranged emergency custody documents that would protect Marcus regardless of what happened to his parents. 3 days before the ceremony, Trevor filed the papers to have me committed. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the day after the naming ceremony, perfect timing for his plan, but also perfect for mine. He had no idea that James Rothschild had already filed counter-documents challenging the commitment order and requesting an immediate competency evaluation by an independent psychiatrist. The final irony was that Trevor's own evidence would destroy him. All those recordings of my confused conversations, all those notes about my declining mental state, all those medical consultations about psychiatric medications, they would prove his intent to defraud me once experts analyzed the timeline and methods he'd used. On the morning of the naming ceremony, I woke up feeling calmer than I had in months. Trevor and Cassandra were bustling around the house, preparing for their guests and putting finishing touches on their performance as the loving family caring for an elderly relative. They had no idea they were about to face the most devastating day of their lives. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to Robert's funeral 3 years earlier. It seemed appropriate, since I was about to bury the daughter I thought I'd raised and expose the man who'd tried to bury me. Trevor knocked on my door that morning with my medication and his usual concerned smile. As I pretended to take the pills that were supposed to keep me docile and confused, I looked into his eyes and saw absolutely nothing. No guilt, no affection, no humanity. Just cold calculation and predatory patience. "Big day today, Dorothy," he said, making notes on his pad. "Lots of people coming to see the baby. Try to stay calm and not get too overwhelmed, okay?" I smiled back at him with the vague, trusting expression I'd perfected over months of deception. "Of course, dear," I said. "I'm so looking forward to celebrating our beautiful family." If only he knew exactly what kind of celebration I had planned for him. The morning of Marcus's naming ceremony dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that makes everything look sharp and defined. As I sat in my room preparing for what would either be my liberation or my final defeat, I couldn't help but think how appropriate the weather was. After months of living in the fog of deception and manipulation, everything was about to become crystal clear. If you're someone who's ever had to confront a person who's been systematically destroying your life while wearing the mask of love and concern, you know that mixture of terror and anticipation I felt as I got dressed that morning. Today, either Trevor Walsh would succeed in having me committed and murdering my daughter, or I would expose him so completely that he'd never hurt another family again. The house had been transformed for the celebration. Cassandra had hired caterers, florists, and even a photographer to document this precious family milestone. White and gold decorations filled the main rooms, and tables of elegant food waited for the 60 guests who would witness what they thought was a simple naming ceremony for a beautiful baby boy. Trevor was in his element, playing the devoted father and husband while carefully monitoring my behavior for any signs that might support his commitment proceedings. He'd dressed Marcus in a tiny white suit and spent the morning accepting congratulations from early arriving relatives who praised him for being such a wonderful provider for his growing family. "Dorothy's having one of her better days," I heard him tell his parents when they arrived. "But if she seems confused or upset, please just redirect her gently. The doctor says overstimulation can trigger episodes." His parents nodded sympathetically, casting concerned glances in my direction. These good people had no idea their son was a would-be murderer who'd spent years planning to destroy the very family they were celebrating. Cassandra was radiant in a flowing blue dress that complemented her post-pregnancy glow. She moved through the crowd with baby Marcus, accepting compliments and playing the perfect young mother. When she introduced me to guests, her voice carried just the right note of loving concern. "This is my mother, Dorothy," she'd say with a protective smile. "She's been such a help with the baby, though we worry about her overdoing things. You know how it is with older relatives, they want to contribute but sometimes forget their limitations." Each introduction felt like another nail in the coffin they'd built for me, but I played my part perfectly, seeming slightly overwhelmed by the crowd, occasionally looking confused about names or relationships, giving everyone present a clear impression of a woman whose mental faculties were gently declining. What none of them knew was that Eleanor Patterson, James Rothschild, Michael Chen, and Dr. Patricia Weinstein were scattered throughout the crowd, observing everything and preparing to serve as witnesses to what was about to unfold. Detective Sarah Rodriguez and 2 plainclothes officers were also present, positioned near exits in case Trevor tried to flee. The ceremony itself was beautiful and heartbreaking. Marcus was presented to family and friends, blessed with prayers for health and happiness, and celebrated as the newest member of our extended family. Trevor spoke movingly about fatherhood, about the responsibility of providing for his son's future, about the importance of family bonds that transcend individual interests. If I hadn't known what he really was, I might have been moved by his performance. He seemed like the ideal father, grateful for his blessings and committed to protecting the people he loved. The crowd was charmed by his sincerity and touched by his obvious devotion to his wife and child. But I was watching Cassandra's face during Trevor's speech, and I saw something that chilled me. She wasn't just playing a role, she was genuinely proud of her husband and excited about their future together. She had no idea that Trevor was planning to kill her within weeks. In her mind, they were partners in a successful scheme that would secure their family's prosperity. After the formal ceremony, guests mingled over lunch while Trevor and Cassandra continued their performances. Trevor made a point of checking on me regularly, asking if I needed to rest, suggesting I might be more comfortable in a quieter room, documenting my responses for his files. Several guests commented on what a thoughtful son-in-law he was, how lucky I was to have such caring family. The moment I'd been waiting for came when Trevor stepped onto the small platform they'd set up for speeches. He'd arranged for a few toasts to the baby, but he wanted to close with remarks about family unity and mutual support. What he didn't know was that I'd asked Eleanor to arrange for the sound system to remain active after his speech. I was going to need it for my own remarks. Trevor's toast was masterful. He spoke about the generations represented in the room, about the wisdom of elders and the hope of children, about the sacred bonds that hold families together through good times and challenges. He thanked everyone for sharing this special day and asked them to join him in wishing Marcus a future filled with love, security, and prosperity. The crowd applauded warmly, and several people wiped away tears. Trevor had positioned himself perfectly as the family patriarch, the responsible leader who would guide them all through whatever challenges lay ahead. That's when I stood up. "Thank you, Trevor, for those beautiful words," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'd like to add a few thoughts of my own about family bonds and sacred trusts." The crowd turned toward me with surprised smiles. Several guests exchanged glances. They hadn't expected the confused elderly woman to want to make a speech. Trevor's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, calculation, and then forced indulgence. "Of course, Dorothy," he said smoothly. "Though maybe you'd prefer to share your thoughts privately later. Sometimes crowds can be overwhelming." "Oh, I'm not overwhelmed at all," I interrupted, walking toward the platform with steady steps and clear eyes. "In fact, my mind hasn't been this clear in months. Isn't that interesting? It's almost like those extra medications you've been giving me were actually making me confused rather than helping me think clearly." The room went quiet. I could see confusion spreading across faces as guests tried to reconcile my sharp, articulate speech with the declining woman they'd been introduced to earlier. Trevor's smile never wavered, but I caught the flash of panic in his eyes. "Dorothy, you seem agitated," he said, moving toward me with his hands outstretched in a calming gesture. "Why don't we?" "Stay right where you are, Trevor," I said firmly, and something in my voice made him freeze. Everyone here came to celebrate Marcus and witness his naming ceremony. But I think they deserve to know exactly what kind of name he's inheriting from his father. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small recording device, one of several backup systems I'd prepared for this moment. 3 weeks ago, I overheard a very interesting phone conversation. I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. Trevor was discussing his plans for my immediate future and for his wife's long-term prospects. "I think everyone here should hear exactly what kind of man has been accepting your congratulations and trust." Trevor's face had gone white, but he was still trying to maintain control. "Dorothy, you're having an episode," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned authority. "You're confused and frightened, and you're misinterpreting things you might have overheard. Everyone here knows how much I love and protect this family." "Do they?" I asked, pressing play on the recording device. Trevor's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. "The meds are making her confused. Tomorrow I'll get her committed, then I just need to get rid of my wife and all that money is ours." The silence that followed was deafening. 60 people stood frozen as the implications of what they'd just heard began to register. Cassandra looked like she'd been struck by lightning, her face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and horror. But I wasn't finished. "That's just the beginning," I said, advancing to the center of the platform. "For the past 4 months, Trevor has been systematically drugging me, isolating me from friends and professional contacts, and building a false medical record of cognitive decline. His plan was to have me declared mentally incompetent, assume legal guardianship of my assets, and then eliminate the only witness to his fraud." I looked directly at Cassandra, whose face had gone ashen. That witness was you, sweetheart. Trevor was planning to murder you as soon as you were no longer useful to his scheme. He's already researched how to make it look like suicide caused by postpartum depression. The room erupted. Guests began talking over each other, some moving toward exits, others pulling out phones. Trevor was backing toward the kitchen, his eyes darting between me and the doors, calculating his chances of escape. But Detective Rodriguez was already moving, her badge visible as she approached him. "Trevor Walsh," she said clearly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder." That's when Trevor finally dropped his mask completely. The concerned son-in-law disappeared, replaced by something cold and vicious. "You stupid old bitch," he snarled at me. "You have no idea what you've just destroyed. That money was going to secure Marcus's future. Cassandra and I built this family around those assets. You've just ruined your own grandchild's life." Cassandra was holding Marcus tightly, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of Trevor's betrayal became clear to her. "You were going to kill me," she whispered, looking at him with horror. "You were going to murder me and steal from my mother and leave Marcus with nothing but a lie." Trevor's laugh was bitter and cold. Marcus would have had everything. $6 million and a father who knew how to use it properly, instead of letting it sit in accounts managed by some old woman who was going to lose her mind anyway. As Detective Rodriguez handcuffed Trevor, I walked over to Cassandra and gently took Marcus from her arms. My grandson looked up at me with bright, curious eyes, completely unaware that his naming ceremony had just become his father's downfall. "Your son is going to grow up knowing the truth," I told Trevor as the officers prepared to take him away. "He's going to know that his grandmother loved him enough to stop his father from becoming a murderer. And he's going to have the security you tried to steal from him, managed by people who actually care about his welfare." Trevor was led away in handcuffs while 60 witnesses stood in stunned silence. The beautiful naming ceremony had become a crime scene, but justice had finally been served. As I held my grandson close, I realized that my months of playing the confused elderly woman had taught me something valuable about the masks people wear and the truths they reveal when they think no one is watching. Trevor's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence, it was overestimating his own cleverness. He'd planned the perfect crime, but he'd forgotten that the victims of perfect crimes sometimes have perfect memories and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike back. The weeks following Marcus's naming ceremony felt like living in the aftermath of an explosion. When you expose a conspiracy that's been years in the making, the consequences ripple outward in ways you can't always predict or control. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after discovering that the people closest to you were your greatest enemies, you'll understand the strange mixture of relief and devastation that followed my victory over Trevor. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Detective Rodriguez needed detailed statements from me and all the witnesses. The district attorney's office opened a comprehensive investigation into Trevor's activities, going back through 3 years of financial records and medical documentation. James Rothschild had to file emergency motions to protect my assets and establish temporary custody arrangements for Marcus while Cassandra dealt with the psychological trauma of learning her husband had planned to murder her. The media attention was intense and unwelcome. Grandmother exposes murder plot at baby's naming ceremony made headlines across the region, and reporters camped outside Trevor and Cassandra's house trying to get interviews. I found myself painted as either a heroic victim who outsmarted her would-be killer or a confused elderly woman who had misinterpreted innocent conversations. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. Trevor's arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. The investigation uncovered that I wasn't his first target. He'd attempted similar schemes with 2 previous elderly clients from his pharmaceutical sales job. In both cases, he'd identified vulnerable widows with substantial assets, cultivated relationships with their families, and begun laying groundwork for financial fraud. Only the timely death of one woman and the intervention of suspicious relatives had prevented those schemes from reaching completion. The accomplice I'd heard on that late-night phone call turned out to be Trevor's cousin, Marcus Brennan, a paralegal who specialized in estate planning and guardianship procedures. Marcus had been providing Trevor with legal advice and document templates for several years, helping him understand the technical requirements for asset seizure and involuntary commitment. When faced with evidence of the murder conspiracy, Marcus agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. But the most devastating revelations concerned Cassandra's level of involvement in Trevor's scheme. The recordings I'd made revealed that my daughter had been an active participant from the beginning, not the innocent victim I'd hoped she might be. She'd helped research my financial holdings, suggested methods for isolating me from friends and advisors, and participated in planning my gradual removal from my own life. The pregnancy itself had been strategically timed to provide emotional leverage and create urgency around my living situation. What Cassandra hadn't known was the full extent of Trevor's ultimate plan. She'd believed they were partners in a scheme to gain control of my assets while keeping me safely contained in residential care. She had no idea that Trevor intended to eliminate her once she was no longer useful, or that his vision of their future included only himself and Marcus. During her police interviews, Cassandra broke down completely. She admitted to her role in the conspiracy while insisting she'd never intended for me to be harmed. She claimed she genuinely believed I was beginning to show signs of cognitive decline and that their intervention was partly motivated by concern for my safety. The additional medications, the isolation, the documentation of my episodes, she'd convinced herself these were necessary measures to protect me from making dangerous decisions. I wanted to believe her. Desperately. She was still my daughter, still the child I'd raised and loved for 38 years. But the recordings revealed conversations where she discussed my future institutionalization with cold calculation, joked about my senile moments, and fantasized about the lifestyle my money would provide. The loving concern she'd shown to my face had been an act as sophisticated as any Academy Award performance. The legal proceedings stretched on for months. Trevor was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, and a dozen related crimes. Cassandra faced charges for her role in the conspiracy, though prosecutors acknowledged that she'd been unaware of Trevor's plans to harm her. Both were released on bail pending trial, but restraining orders prevented them from contacting me or approaching my property. The custody battle over Marcus was heartbreaking for everyone involved. Cassandra was clearly a loving mother who had never intended to harm her son, but her involvement in the conspiracy against me raised questions about her judgment and stability. Trevor's criminal charges made him an obviously unsuitable parent. Child services became involved, and Marcus was placed in temporary foster care while the courts sorted out his long-term welfare. I petitioned for emergency custody of my grandson, arguing that I was his only family member who hadn't participated in the conspiracy and that my substantial resources could provide him with stability during this traumatic period. The petition was controversial. Several of Trevor's relatives argued that a 73-year-old woman wasn't an appropriate primary caregiver for an infant, and some questioned whether the stress of recent events had affected my own mental health. The competency evaluation that followed was exhaustive and somewhat humiliating. Court-appointed psychiatrists, neurologists, and geriatricians put me through batteries of tests to assess my cognitive function, emotional stability, and physical capability. They interviewed my doctors, reviewed my medical records, and observed my daily activities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Trevor's false documentation of my decline meant I had to prove my competence more thoroughly than most custody petitioners twice my age. Fortunately, the evaluation results were unambiguous. My cognitive function tested in the superior range for any age group. My physical health was excellent. My emotional stability, while understandably shaken by recent events, showed no signs of serious dysfunction. The psychiatrist's report noted that my ability to maintain a complex deception for months while gathering evidence of criminal activity demonstrated exceptional mental acuity and emotional resilience. The custody hearing became a media circus, with reporters and cameras following every development. I testified about my relationship with Marcus, my financial ability to provide for his needs, and my plans for his upbringing. Character witnesses included Eleanor Patterson, Dr. Patricia Weinstein, and several other longtime friends who vouched for my stability and integrity. The most difficult testimony came from Cassandra herself. She looked haggard and broken as she acknowledged her role in the conspiracy against me while pleading for the chance to remain part of her son's life. She admitted that her judgment had been compromised by greed and manipulation, but insisted that she'd never stopped loving Marcus or me. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said, looking directly at me with tears streaming down her face. "I know I've destroyed any right I had to call you my mother. But please don't let my mistakes cost Marcus the chance to know his family. He's innocent in all of this." The judge awarded me temporary custody of Marcus while permanent arrangements were determined. Cassandra was granted supervised visitation rights, contingent on her completing psychological counseling and maintaining her cooperation with the ongoing criminal investigation. Trevor's parental rights were suspended pending the outcome of his trial. Taking custody of a 6-month-old baby at my age was challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding and diaper changes, the sheer physical demands of infant care. I'd forgotten how exhausting it could be. But Marcus was a sweet, easy baby who seemed to thrive with consistent, loving attention. Having him in my life gave me purpose and joy during a period when I was grappling with profound grief and betrayal. I hired a full-time nanny to help with Marcus's care, and I moved back into my own house in Westchester after having it thoroughly cleaned and redecorated. The guest suite where I'd been imprisoned was converted into a nursery, transformed from a place of confinement into a space of hope and new beginnings. The financial recovery process was complex but ultimately successful. Trevor had managed to transfer some assets into accounts he controlled, but the emergency legal actions James Rothschild had taken prevented most of the theft. The court ordered restitution for the money that had been stolen, and Trevor's assets were seized to cover damages. My investment portfolio, carefully managed by Michael Chen throughout the entire ordeal, had actually grown during the months I was supposedly too confused to understand financial matters. But the emotional recovery was far more complicated. Living through months of systematic manipulation had shaken my trust in my own perceptions and judgment. I found myself second-guessing interactions with service providers, friends, even medical professionals. The trauma of discovering that my own daughter had participated in plotting against me created wounds that professional counseling could address but never completely heal. The hardest part was reconciling the Cassandra I'd raised with the woman who'd helped plan my destruction. I kept searching through my memories, looking for signs I'd missed, moments when her mask might have slipped. Had she always been capable of such deception? Had I failed as a mother by raising someone who could participate in such cruelty? Or had Trevor's influence genuinely corrupted someone who might otherwise have remained decent? I attended therapy sessions to work through these questions, but the answers remained elusive. Dr. Patricia Weinstein, who had observed the entire situation unfold, suggested that Cassandra might have gradually rationalized increasingly unethical behavior until she lost sight of basic moral boundaries. The process of corruption, she explained, often happens so slowly that perpetrators convince themselves they're acting reasonably even when they're planning terrible things. Trevor's trial began 8 months after the naming ceremony. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his conspiracy, including the recordings I'd made, financial documents showing his mounting debts and planned asset transfers, and medical evidence that he'd been drugging me with substances designed to create symptoms of cognitive decline. His own meticulous record-keeping became the primary evidence against him. All those notes he'd made about my supposed mental deterioration actually documented his systematic campaign to make me appear incompetent. The defense strategy was predictable but still painful to endure. Trevor's attorneys argued that he genuinely believed I was developing dementia and that his actions were motivated by concern for my safety and welfare. They portrayed him as a devoted family man whose only crime was trying to protect his elderly mother-in-law from making dangerous decisions while ensuring his son's financial security. They claimed the recorded phone conversation had been taken out of context, that Trevor's references to getting rid of Cassandra were metaphorical expressions of frustration with their marital problems, not literal murder plans. They suggested that my months of pretending to be confused had actually caused real psychological damage, making me paranoid and delusional about their innocent intentions. I had to testify for 3 days about my experience living in their house, the systematic isolation and medication, the surveillance and manipulation. Trevor's attorneys tried to portray me as a bitter old woman who'd misunderstood her family's loving concern, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. The hidden cameras, the altered medication schedule, the forged medical records, none of that could be explained away as misguided concern. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Trevor was sentenced to 25 years in prison without possibility of parole. The judge noted that his crimes represented a particularly heinous form of elder abuse, targeting the victim's most fundamental vulnerabilities while exploiting family bonds and social trust. Cassandra's case was resolved through a plea agreement. She testified against Trevor in exchange for reduced charges and a suspended sentence contingent on completing community service, psychological counseling, and restitution payments. She would avoid prison time, but she would carry a criminal record and the knowledge that her choices had nearly cost both our lives. The day Trevor was sentenced, I sat in the courtroom holding Marcus, who had grown into a beautiful, alert 9-month-old baby. As the bailiff led Trevor away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at his son one final time. The expression on his face wasn't remorse or love, it was calculation, as if he was still trying to figure out how he could have played the situation differently to achieve his goals. That look confirmed everything I'd suspected about Trevor's true nature. He wasn't a man who'd been corrupted by greed or driven to extremes by desperation. He was a predator who had identified vulnerable targets and systematically planned their destruction. If I hadn't been able to expose him, he would have moved on to other victims after disposing of Cassandra and me. The civil lawsuit that followed resulted in additional financial restitution and the establishment of a legal precedent for prosecuting similar elder abuse conspiracies. The case attracted national attention from advocacy groups working to protect elderly people from financial exploitation, and I found myself reluctantly becoming a spokesperson for elder rights and family fraud prevention. But my primary focus remained on Marcus and trying to build some kind of relationship with Cassandra that could survive what had happened between us. The supervised visits were awkward and painful at first. Cassandra would sit across from me in the family services office, watching her son but barely able to make eye contact with me. The gulf between us felt insurmountable. How do you rebuild trust with someone who participated in planning your imprisonment and potentially your death? Gradually, though, we began to find our way towards something that might eventually become forgiveness, if not full reconciliation. Cassandra's therapy was helping her understand how she'd become complicit in Trevor's scheme, and she was working to make amends through her community service with elder advocacy organizations. She would never again be the daughter I thought I'd raised, but she might eventually become someone I could trust to be part of Marcus's life. The investigation into Trevor's pharmaceutical sales activities revealed additional victims and led to criminal charges against his employer for inadequate oversight of employee access to client information. The company settled multiple lawsuits and implemented new protocols for protecting elderly customers from exploitation by sales staff. Marcus's first birthday party was a small, quiet celebration held in my garden. Just Eleanor Patterson, Dr. Patricia Weinstein, James Rothschild, and a few other close friends who had supported us through the ordeal. Cassandra was allowed to attend under supervision, and she spent the afternoon playing with her son while maintaining careful distance from me. As I watched Marcus take his first tentative steps across my lawn, I reflected on how much had changed in the year since Trevor had begun his final push to destroy our family. The innocent baby who had been intended as a prop in his parents' criminal conspiracy was now a thriving toddler who would grow up knowing the truth about his heritage, both the darkness of his father's crimes and the strength his grandmother had shown in stopping them. The financial security Trevor had tried to steal would be there for Marcus when he needed it, managed by trustees who actually cared about his welfare rather than their own enrichment. He would never want for anything material, but more importantly, he would grow up understanding the difference between people who claim to love you and people who actually protect you when it matters most. I had survived Trevor's attempt to bury me alive in institutional care and pharmaceutical fog. I had saved my daughter's life and preserved my grandson's inheritance. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that age and vulnerability don't have to mean powerlessness, and that sometimes the greatest revenge against those who underestimate you is simply refusing to become the victim they expected you to be. The woman who had moved into that guest suite thinking she was accepting her family's loving care had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed and survived betrayals she never could have imagined. And the man who thought he could manipulate a confused old woman into surrendering her fortune had learned that predators sometimes choose the wrong prey. 3 years have passed since that naming ceremony changed everything, and I'm writing this from my study in the house where Robert and I built our life together. The house Trevor thought he'd inherit after having me committed and murdering my daughter. If you've followed my story this far, you might be wondering how this kind of betrayal changes someone, and whether real healing is possible after discovering that the people you trusted most were planning your destruction. Let me tell you about the lessons I've learned and the unexpected ways this nightmare led to the most meaningful chapter of my life. Marcus is now 3.5 years old, a bright, curious little boy who calls me grandma and has no memory of the chaos surrounding his early months. His walking, talking, and asking endless questions about everything he encounters. When he looks at me with those bright blue eyes, so much like Cassandra's, but without the calculation I learned to recognize in hers, I see hope and innocence that Trevor's schemes couldn't destroy. The custody arrangement has evolved into something that works for all of us. I have primary custody and day-to-day responsibility for Marcus, but Cassandra has gradually earned increased visitation rights as she's demonstrated genuine change and commitment to making amends. She completed her court-ordered counseling, fulfilled her community service requirements, and has spent the past 2 years working as a victim advocate for elder abuse organizations. Watching Cassandra work with other families who've experienced financial exploitation and manipulation has been both heartbreaking and healing. She brings a unique perspective to that work. She understands how family members can be gradually drawn into conspiracies against their own relatives, how small compromises can lead to enormous betrayals, and how victims and perpetrators can both be trapped in cycles of deception. Our relationship will never be what it was before Trevor entered our lives, but it's become something different and perhaps more honest. We talk now about difficult truths we avoided when she was growing up, about money, about family expectations, about the ways people can love each other while still causing tremendous harm. Cassandra has accepted responsibility for her choices without making excuses, and she's working to become someone worthy of her son's love and trust. The supervised visits have gradually expanded to overnight stays and weekend trips. I watch carefully for any signs that Cassandra might be reverting to manipulative behaviors, but what I see instead is a woman who's genuinely committed to rebuilding her life on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. She's remarried, a social worker named David Chen who knows her full history and has helped her continue her emotional recovery. Trevor remains in prison, where he'll stay for at least 15 more years. I've heard through legal channels that he's been a difficult inmate, unable to accept responsibility for his crimes and constantly filing appeals claiming his conviction was based on the confused testimony of a mentally ill elderly woman. His refusal to acknowledge reality or express genuine remorse confirms everything I suspected about his character. More troubling, Trevor has attempted to contact Marcus through intermediaries, sending letters and gifts that I've intercepted with help from law enforcement. His messages reveal an ongoing obsession with the inheritance he believes was stolen from him, and continued attempts to manipulate the situation for his benefit. The prison monitors his communications now, and has been warned that any further attempts to contact his son will result in additional charges. The financial impact of Trevor's scheme was ultimately manageable, thanks to the legal protections James Rothschild had in place and the quick action we took to freeze asset transfers. My investment portfolio has recovered completely, and the restitution orders have provided additional compensation for the emotional and psychological damages. More importantly, the trust funds established for Marcus are secure and professionally managed, ensuring his future regardless of what happens to the rest of us. But the most significant changes in my life haven't been financial, they've been personal and philosophical. Going through months of systematic manipulation and abuse taught me things about human nature, about vulnerability and resilience, that I never could have learned any other way. I've discovered that being underestimated can be a source of power rather than just frustration. Trevor's assumption that I was a helpless, confused old woman became the weapon I used to destroy his plans. When people dismiss you because of your age or perceived limitations, they often reveal their true intentions more readily because they don't think you're capable of understanding or responding effectively. The experience also taught me about the insidious nature of psychological manipulation. Trevor didn't begin by openly stealing from me or threatening my safety. He started by offering help, expressing concern, and gradually increasing his involvement in my life until I was completely dependent on him. The transition from independence to imprisonment happened so slowly that it might have been invisible if I hadn't been deliberately watching for it. I've become involved with elder advocacy organizations, sharing my story at conferences and training sessions for social workers, attorneys, and law enforcement officers who work with financial abuse cases. The response has been overwhelming. Apparently, Trevor's scheme was far from unique, and many families are dealing with similar situations where trusted relatives or caregivers systematically exploit elderly family members. One of the most rewarding aspects of this advocacy work has been connecting with other survivors who've escaped similar situations. I've met widows who discovered their children were stealing from their accounts, elderly men whose caregivers were drugging them to maintain control, and families torn apart by inheritance disputes that mask deeper patterns of abuse and manipulation. Each story is unique, but the patterns are remarkably consistent. The perpetrators almost always begin by positioning themselves as helpful, concerned, and indispensable. They isolate their victims from outside support systems, create dependence through medications or other means of control, and build documentation to support narratives of incompetence or mental decline. The victims often realize something is wrong but struggle to get help because their accusations sound paranoid or confused to outsiders. My case has become something of a model for how victims can protect themselves by documenting abuse while it's happening, maintaining secret communication channels with trusted allies, and preparing comprehensive evidence before attempting to expose their abusers. But I always emphasize that my success depended partly on luck and resources that many victims don't have. The legal precedents established by Trevor's prosecution have led to stronger protections for elderly people and clearer procedures for investigating suspected guardianship fraud. Several states have updated their laws based partly on evidence from our case, making it harder for predators to gain control of vulnerable adults' assets and easier for victims to seek help. But the most profound change in my life has been my relationship with Marcus and the unexpected joy of raising a child at this stage of my life. I thought my parenting days were long behind me, but caring for Marcus has renewed my sense of purpose and given me energy I didn't know I still possessed. Watching him discover the world reminds me daily of the resilience and adaptability that allowed me to survive Trevor's assault on my life and identity. Children accept change and challenge with remarkable flexibility, and Marcus has adapted beautifully to his unusual family situation. He knows he has a daddy in prison who made bad choices, a mommy who visits and loves him but can't live with him, and a grandma who takes care of him every day. As Marcus grows older, I'll have to explain more about what happened during his first year of life and help him understand why his family structure is different from his friends. But children are remarkably capable of handling complex truths when they're presented with love and honesty, and I'm confident that knowing his real history will make him stronger rather than traumatize him. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the choices I made during those months when I was gathering evidence against Trevor. They wonder if I should have sought help earlier, or if the risk I took by continuing to live in his house was worth the comprehensive case I was able to build against him. The answer is complicated. I could have escaped Trevor's immediate control much earlier by simply revealing that I was aware of his deception. But doing so would have allowed him to adjust his tactics, potentially making him more dangerous to Cassandra and less likely to face meaningful consequences for his crimes. The months I spent playing his victim gave me the evidence needed to stop him permanently and protect other potential victims. More importantly, that experience taught me that survival sometimes requires patience, strategy, and the willingness to endure temporary suffering in order to achieve long-term safety. The confused elderly woman I pretended to be was actually the most effective disguise I could have chosen. It allowed me to observe, plan, and act without triggering Trevor's defenses. I've also learned that forgiveness doesn't always look the way people expect it to. I've forgiven Cassandra not because her actions were excusable, but because holding on to anger was poisoning my ability to enjoy my life with Marcus. Forgiveness, in our case, meant accepting that she had made terrible choices while also acknowledging her genuine efforts to change and make amends. But I haven't forgiven Trevor, and I don't think I ever will. His actions weren't the result of desperation or poor judgment, they were the calculated choices of a predator who saw vulnerable people as opportunities for exploitation. He showed no remorse when he was caught, no concern for the harm he'd caused, and no commitment to change his behavior. Some people forfeit the right to forgiveness through the depth and persistence of their cruelty. As I finish writing this story, Marcus is napping in the sunroom where I used to have my morning coffee with Robert. The house is quiet and peaceful, filled with the sounds of normal family life rather than the tension and fear that characterized those months when Trevor was systematically destroying our lives. If you're someone dealing with family members who seem too interested in your finances, too eager to help with decisions you're capable of making yourself, too concerned about your mental state or physical safety, trust your instincts. Document everything. Maintain relationships with people outside your family. Keep control of your important documents and financial accounts. And remember that the people who truly care about your welfare will respect your autonomy even when they're worried about your safety. Don't let anyone convince you that age means incompetence, that needing some help means surrendering all control, or that family love automatically equals trustworthiness. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who have legitimate reasons to be in your life and who know exactly what vulnerabilities to exploit. My story had a happy ending because I was fortunate enough to have the resources, skills, and support network needed to fight back effectively. But every day, elderly people are losing their independence, their assets, and sometimes their lives to family members and caregivers who see them as problems to be solved or opportunities to be exploited. Marcus is stirring now, probably ready for his afternoon snack and the stories I read to him every day. In a few years, he'll be old enough to hear the story of how his grandma saved his life by refusing to be the victim his father expected her to be. And maybe, when he's much older, he'll understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let people destroy what you're trying to protect. Trevor Walsh thought he could manipulate a confused old woman into surrendering her fortune and her life. Instead, he encountered someone who had spent 73 years learning how to survive, how to fight, and how to protect the people she loved most. He picked the wrong grandmother. And that mistake cost him everything. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonates with you, if it reminds you of situations in your own family or community, please share it. Stories like mine need to be told, because predators like Trevor count on their victims staying silent and isolated. Don't let them win. Fight back. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And never, Ever let anyone convince you that your age or vulnerability makes you powerless? Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. And sometimes that's exactly the advantage you need to survive.